Bananas generate $14.4 billion in export value every year. They support food and livelihoods for around 400 million people across developing economies. A soil fungus called TR4 is now attacking that foundation. And once it reaches roots, no chemical on Earth can stop it. That alone would be serious. But the deeper risk is genetic uniformity at global scale. Most supermarket bananas are Cavendish clones, almost exact genetic copies of one another. In this episode, we trace how that weakness collides with market power, policy gaps, and trade dependence. Around 50% of global banana output comes from Cavendish. In export markets, the share rises to about 95%. So global trade is concentrated in one cultivar, while pathogen pressure widens. This is monoculture risk, a single genetic template spread across continents. Cavendish plants are propagated vegetatively, through corms and suckers rather than seeds. That method keeps traits consistent for trade logistics. It also removes the natural genetic variation that usually slows disease spread. If one plant is susceptible, the whole clone network is exposed. The pathogen is Fusarium oxysporum, FSP cubensi, tropical race 4, known as TR4. It is now confirmed in at least 24 countries across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. This is no longer a regional plant health issue. It is a transcontinental supply risk. TR4 enters through roots and invades vascular tissue inside the plant stem. It blocks water and nutrient flow until leaves yellow, wilt, and die. No fungicide reverses this once established. No proven soil treatment removes it from contaminated fields. What makes TR4 uniquely hard to defeat is a chlamydospore, a thick-walled, resting spore. It can remain dormant yet infectious in soil for more than 4 decades. That persistence defeats normal crop rotation logic. It also undermines standard fumigation routines. TR4 also hides in time. The latency from infection to visible symptoms can run from 6 to 24 months. During that window, it moves through irrigation water, boots, and machinery without clear visual warning. By the time yellowing appears, containment costs are already much higher. Once symptoms are obvious, the soil is often saturated with spores. At that stage, land can become effectively unusable for Cavendish production. That turns a disease event into an asset write-down. In export-dependent regions, it can also become a labor shock. This is not the banana sector's first collapse cycle. Before the 1960s, Gros Michel dominated global trade and shipping routes. It had tougher skin and traveled better under rough maritime handling. It anchored old fruit export systems in Central America. Gros Michel was a triploid clone, meaning it was genetically sterile and reproduced by cloning. When Fusarium race 1 spread through Central America in the 1950s, resistance options were thin. Millions of hectares were eventually written off. Regional economic and political stress followed. The industry then switched to Cavendish because it resisted race 1. But Cavendish came with expensive logistics requirements. Reefers had to hold cargo around 13 to 15 degrees Celsius, and destination ports had to scale ethylene ripening capacity. The trade survived, but the monoculture logic stayed intact. That is the core paradox. The industry solved one pathogen with one replacement clone. It did not solve structural genetic fragility. TR4 is exploiting that unresolved design flaw right now. TR4 was first formally identified in Taiwan in 1970. By the 1990s, it had spread across much of Southeast Asia. The geographic arc was widening long before most importing markets treated it as an existential threat. Early warnings existed, but coordination lagged. Australia detected TR4 in the Northern Territory in 1997. The Philippines followed with confirmed detection in 2005. Both were major signals for export systems tied to Cavendish. Yet global sourcing strategies remained heavily concentrated. Endemic reservoirs then took hold across Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and China. In 2013, the pathogen jumped into commercial Cavendish in northern Mozambique. That move mattered because it proved long-distance establishment in a new continent. The problem was now global in biology and trade. The Mozambique impact was severe. Productive area losses reached 86% in affected zones. Local agricultural workforce losses reached 88%. Those are not manageable efficiency losses. They are structural collapse metrics. Then came the breakpoint for global markets. In 2019, TR4 entered Latin America, which generates over 55% of banana exports by value, roughly $8 billion in annual shipments. So the pathogen moved from peripheral risk into the center of world supply. Colombia confirmed the first outbreak in La Guajira. The Colombian Agricultural Institute declared a national emergency. Authorities launched surveillance flights, checkpoint controls, and port sanitization protocols. Those actions slowed spread, but did not stop regional progression. TR4 then advanced into Magdalena. Peru confirmed cases in 2021. Venezuela followed in 2023. In December 2025, Ecuador's Agrocalidad confirmed TR4 in El Oro, near the southern border with Peru. Ecuador is the global swing supplier. It accounts for about 26.3% of world banana exports, valued near $3.8 billion. When other origins are hit by weather or logistic shocks, Ecuador often stabilizes supply. That makes its phytosanitary status globally consequential. Shipments from Ecuador already fell 3.7% in 2024. Total export volume dropped to just under 6 million tons. Drivers included adverse weather, weaker Russian trade, and higher prevention costs. TR4 adds a potential structural layer to what could have been a cyclical dip. Modeling for Colombia's Antioquia department shows the financial scale. If TR4 reaches full geographic spread, projected export loss is about $456 million per year. That's 39,496 hectares. In other words, the downside is not hypothetical. Production losses in that same scenario reach about 1.3 million tons annually. Immediate land value destruction is estimated around $54.6 million. Land and output are hit together, which magnifies financing stress. Banks then reprice risk across the whole chain. Labor impacts are similarly large. Estimates show 31,597 direct agricultural jobs at risk. Indirect supply chain losses add another 110,589 positions. A plant disease quickly becomes a regional employment crisis. Peru's Piura region, the country's leading organic banana zone, shows early deterioration. About 45% of farms are already infected. Roughly 10% have been fully eradicated. These are frontline indicators, not distant projections. Affected farms in Piura lose about 13.7 tons per hectare per year. For a typical smallholder, that can mean around $4,000 in annual income forfeited. Yield pressure and cash pressure arrive at the same time. Recovery options narrow fast. Over a 25-year horizon, the valuation gap is stark. Unaffected farms show net present value around $48,014 per hectare. TR4 compromised farms collapse toward $8,535 per hectare. That is roughly an 82% destruction of enterprise value. Now add market structure to biology. Until the 1980s, Dole, Chiquita, Del Monte, Fifes, and Noboa controlled about 80% of global banana trade. They owned plantations, fleets, terminals, and ripening assets. Vertical integration concentrated power, but also concentrated responsibility. That model was dismantled in the 1990s. Supermarket consolidation in Europe and North America forced major divestments. Plantation ownership fell, shipping was leased, and coordination became fragmented. The sector shifted to an asset-light model with thinner producer buffers. Today, Chiquita sources more than 60% of bananas from independent growers. Del Monte buys about 60% from independents as well. Risk, therefore, sits further downstream with producers who have the weakest margins. Disease costs are landing where balance sheets are thinnest. Retail concentration tightened the squeeze. Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, and Morrisons together account for over 75% of UK retail sales. Since 2009, they have increasingly sourced directly from farms, bypassing older trading structures. Buyer leverage grew while producer bargaining power shrank. What emerged is an hourglass system. Millions of growers sit at one end and consumers at the other. In the middle, large retailers capture about 40% of final retail value. They can force low procurement prices, threaten delisting, impose deductions, delay payments, and lock growers into insecure contracts. TR4 turns pricing into a survival issue. Growers now fund cement paths, perimeter fences, disinfection stations, footbaths, and certified clean planting material. Those measures add about 13.4% to baseline costs, reaching roughly $5,319 per hectare each year. Cheap banana retail strategy now collides with expensive biosecurity. Fresh Del Monte CEO Mohamed Abu Ghazala summarized the tension clearly in earnings commentary. Farmers, he said, can no longer absorb these costs alone. Long-term category stability requires cost-sharing across the value chain. Without that, biology will outrun commercial assumptions. Balance sheets reinforce that warning. Dole's contractual obligation to market cap ratio is about 6.12. Chiquita's is around 14.40, leaving very little shock absorption room. Fresh Del Monte is stronger at about 1.52, but sector-wide capital structure remains fragile under prolonged quarantine risk. Florida citrus is the closest analog for trajectory risk. Citrus greening is an incurable bacterial disease spread by insect vectors. It attacks phloem, while TR4 attacks xylem, but the production pattern is alarmingly similar. Once established, recovery is slow and costly. After Florida detection in 2005, orange output fell about 74%. Production dropped from nearly 300 million boxes in the 2003 to 2004 season to fewer than 20 million by 2022 to 2023. That is not a temporary dip. It is a structural regime shift. Bearing acreage in Florida fell about 30%. Annual financial losses exceeded $1 billion. Employment losses were roughly 5,000 jobs per year. Regional agricultural identity changed alongside output. Supply then reconcentrated elsewhere. California now produces over 80% of U.S. fresh oranges. Global orange juice became more concentrated in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Even there, disease incidence reached 44.35%, about 90 million infected trees, by late 2024. Coffee leaf rust shows a second reference case. The 2012 to 2013 Central American epidemic hit about 70% of farms. Output losses reached roughly 2.7 million bags. Economic damage was estimated near $500 million. Labor displacement from that rust wave exceeded 370,000 workers. Area affected was about 74% in El Salvador. Guatemala reported around 70%, while Costa Rica was near 64%. The social shock spread beyond farms into entire local economies. Coffee at least had a genetic head start. Breeders could work with 9 recognized resistance genes in Coffea arabica. Bananas face a harder baseline today. No commercially dominant, fully market-accepted resistant cultivar is yet globally deployed. So prevention still carries the highest short-term return. In Colombia, prevention, net present value, is estimated around $112,527 per hectare in Antioquia. In Magdalena, the estimate is about $95,389 per hectare. Those values justify early spending before visible outbreak. Benefit-cost ratios support the same conclusion. Antioquia sits around 4.2 and Magdalena around 3.1. In practical terms, each dollar spent can protect about $3 to $4 of downstream biological asset value. Smallholders gain if financing is available. Basic mitigation kits, priced near $688 per farm, have shown useful results where access exists. Once infection is confirmed, protocols escalate quickly. Standard response includes immediate quarantine and destruction around a 10-meter radius. It also requires soil fumigation under sealed plastic, quaternary ammonium tool sanitation, and about an 18-month fallow period. Genetic adaptation is now accelerating. Tropic Biosciences raised $105 million in Series C funding in March 2026. Its GEIGS platform uses RNA interference to suppress pathogen genes without inserting foreign DNA. Commercial TR4 resistant Cavendish deployment is targeted for 2027. Regulatory signals there are meaningful. Tropics non-browning gene-edited bananas already received approvals in the USA and Canada. They were also approved in Colombia, Honduras, and the Philippines. That track record lowers uncertainty for follow-on traits. Another milestone arrived in February 2026. University of Queensland researchers identified a key resistance region on chromosome 5 in wild Calcutta 4. This gives breeders molecular markers for early selection. Seedlings can now be screened after germination, instead of waiting through long field cycles. A separate pipeline also advanced to market. QCAV4, developed over 20 years at Queensland University of Technology, was approved for commercial cultivation in Australia and New Zealand in 2024. It is the first genetically modified banana approved in that context. The program provides a live commercial test case. Under deliberate TR4 pressure across 5 crop cycles, QCAV4 showed about 2% incidence. Unmodified controls in the same trials saw around 66 to 84% mortality. The performance gap is large enough to change investment decisions, but scaling still depends on market acceptance and distribution. Formosana, a somaclonal Cavendish variant, is already deployed in the Philippines. Distribution has reached about 1.3 million plantlets across roughly 8,000 hectares. Reported disease incidence is around 4.1 to 4.3%. Standard Cavendish, in comparable settings, shows roughly 25 to 30% mortality. Policy quality now separates containment outcomes. Australia has kept TR4 confined to a tightly monitored area in far north Queensland since 2015. The framework sits under the Biosecurity Act 2014. A mandatory industry levy of 2.19 cents per kilogram funds coordinated response, including buyout of the first infected commercial farm in Tully. Ecuador invested early. It spent about $34 million over 14 years on border defense and surveillance. Drones and satellites covered about 40% of banana growing area before detection. After confirmation, the World Bank approved a $1.1 billion package with a $200 million catastrophe-deferred drawdown option for immediate liquidity. Colombia allocated about $7.2 million to surveillance and prevention from 2019 to 2023, added about $2.64 million for a regional phytosanitary intelligence center using AI models. The Philippines pivoted after containment weakened. Its crop insurance covers about 55% of baseline production costs, far below sterilization losses. As incumbents strain, new origins are expanding. Cambodia's fresh banana exports rose about 30% in early 2025. Revenue reached around $180 million, on volume near 344,000 tons. Expansion was linked to 15 registered Chinese companies operating across about 16,000 hectares in Ratanakiri, Kratie, and Stung Treng. Vietnam exported about $380 million in bananas in 2024 and rose to 6th among global exporters. China, South Korea, and Japan absorbed most shipments. Fresh Del Monte has also started developing production in non-traditional zones, such as Somalia. Geographic spread is now a core risk strategy. The largest gap is institutional, not scientific. Adaptation finance often stalls nationally and misses local cooperatives and farms doing biosecurity. No binding rule forces retailers to pay prices that cover TR4 resilient production. Many custom systems lack phytosanitary declarations and shoe disinfection for arrivals from endemic zones. Consumer acceptance is another unresolved constraint. No funded global campaign prepares buyers for resistant varieties that may look or ripen differently from Cavendish. As the FAO Director General warned, acceptance by retailers and consumers remains a challenge. If new cultivars fail at the shelf, billions in breeding investment can lose value. Some pricing models show a path. Aldi shifted in 2022 away from spot price suppression toward transparent supplier pricing linked to fair trade cost factors. Fair trade then raised its minimum banana price by 4.6%, effective January 2026. It also added an extra $1 per case for TR4 research and prevention infrastructure. Outside those models, pass-through remains limited. Global banana export prices are projected to rise 15 to 20% in the near term. Disease control costs, biosecurity spending, and EU pesticide changes are converging. EU rules removed 2 widely used Cavendish fungicides and raised baseline production costs by about 10%. Demand-side behavior helps explain retailer resistance. Banana-owned price elasticity sits between -0.33 and -0.70, so moderate price rises do not collapse demand. Cross-price data is sharper. A 1% rise in fruit spending lifts bananas about 1.18%, apples 2.15%, and oranges 1.74%. As bananas lose discount edge, substitution pressure rises. Across Europe, bananas already reach about 89% of households. Around 75% of consumers eat them at least weekly. Yet about 59% cannot recall the exact price of their latest purchase. That gives retailers room to reprice if they share disease costs more fairly. Next comes consolidation at unusual scale. Rising biosecurity costs will push many smaller producers out of export channels. Production will concentrate in capitalized operators, relocating to cleaner zones in West Africa and Southeast Asia. Survival depends on closing the farmer-retailer pricing gap before resistant cultivars become the viable baseline. If that gap stays open, the ending is familiar. Cavendish follows Gros Michel because biology and economics stayed misaligned. The result would hit more than supermarket choice. It would destabilize food security and livelihoods in countries built around a vulnerable clone.